What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, I'd like to go over a bunch of exercises together to get more practice with attributes in the DOM through JavaScript together. In the previous video, we looked at attributes. We looked at things like set attribute, get attribute, toggle attribute, and remove attribute. In this video, we're going to get more practice with those methods so that we can actually see how we can actually change things inside the DOM and the effect that that has on the actual UI of the page, as well as a couple other things that go along with it. Let's get right to the exercises. All right, so as in previous exercise videos, I have a little bit of comments in these files. I'm going to read through them, give you a bit of an explanation as to how we want to go through each of these. I'll give you a chance to pause the video, and then we'll go through a potential solution together and a bit of a walkthrough. All right, so for the warm-up exercise here, now what I'd like you to do is create a new HTML file that has the following elements in it, right? So we want to have a head tag with a title with some text in the title. And then we want a body tag simply with an h1 tag. So the only thing in this body is an h1 tag that has some text inside of it. And then I'd like you to open up this HTML file in your browser and open up kind of the dev tools alongside of it, whether you have it on the bottom or on the side, doesn't really matter, as long as you can kind of read what's in there. And inside the dev tools console, what I want you to do is see if you can change the ID attribute of the h1 tag to be the value heading, because notice that when we actually create it in HTML statically to start, there's no ID attribute or class attribute. Okay, so we're going to manipulate this through the DOM API in JavaScript in the console for now. So add an ID attribute to the h1 tag and give it a value of heading, and then also add a class attribute and give it the value of blue, and then actually switch back to the elements tab in the DOM, in the DevTools, and actually make sure that in the DOM there, it's actually showing up correctly with an ID and a class as you set it. So give that a shot, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so to start here, I'm just gonna create a new file. I'm gonna call this warmup.html. So in here, I'm gonna kind of have my doc type HTML, create my HTML tag inside my head, and then I'll have a title. In the title, I'll just call this a warm-up exercise, just so that it's a bit more clear what this is. Then I'll have my body tag with an h1 tag inside of it. It really helps to have these autocompletes in this case to actually make this HTML coding a little bit faster. Inside the h1 tag, I'm just gonna put whatever text in here. I'm gonna say, welcome to the attributes exercises, right? You can have whatever you want in there. And I'm going to save that. So notice, right, to start, this h1 tag has no attributes, right? It only has text inside of it, but there are no actual attributes on the h1. So I'm going to open up this in my Finder here, or your Explorer if you're on Windows, and I'm going to double click this to open this up in Chrome in this case. So it's going to open up. There we go. We have a nice, very large h1. If I zoom in, I'm going to open up my dev tools here on the right hand side. I'm going to zoom in a whole bunch there as well. And we can see that if I open this up, we have my title, we have my body with my h1 inside of it, right? Now, if I switch back to my console, let's do a document. Oh, how did that happen? Let's do a document.querySelector. And I'm going to try to select the h1 tag in this case. Okay, so if I do that, you'll notice I do get the h1 tag using just h1 as a query selector for the element tag, because that's the only tag in this case, and it's also the first tag. So that's pretty easy to grab. Now, we want to change the attributes ID as well as class on this thing. So how do we do that? Well, technically we can directly change ID as a property on this, and it will change the ID of this class. So I want to show you something. If I do .id on this and I change it to heading, just like that, and I switch back to my elements tab, you'll see that heading actually shows up here, right? So the way that I've done this is kind of using the property of the h1 object, which is then going to synchronize to the attribute. I'm going to do the reverse for the class. So I'm going to say document.querySelector. and I'll do my h1 again. And now I want to do the set attributes just to make this a little bit different. So I'll do set attribute. And in here, what I want to do is I want to set the class attribute. And this is one way to do it. Again, there's other ways to do this, like I just showed you with ID. And in this case, I actually forget what we want to change this to. We wanted to change this to blue, right? So I'm going to change this to the string blue, right? Just like that. So this is the attribute that I want to change, and then this is the value I want to change it to. So if I do that and I press enter, what you'll see is that now if I go back to my elements tab, indeed we have class of blue in there. But what's interesting is if I come back here as well again, and I do document.querySelector h1 again, let me just type this out real quick, document query selector h1, and I say dot class list, which is actually the list of classes. We're going to see this in the styles video later when we take a look at that. We can also do class name, and this is going to give a stringified version instead of actually separating out the spaces in this case. And we can see that it is indeed blue. Right? So class name is the attribute, and we can't use class because that's a reserved word in JavaScript, and that kind of is the whole class and extend structure, object-oriented programming. So they had to use class name for the property name for this object because you can't use reserved words, just like you couldn't use, for example, for or const or something like that. And in this case, we're getting blue, right? So we changed it through the attribute, and we got the property changed to blue, and we did the reverse for ID, right? We changed it through the property, which is the object, and we actually saw that it changed in the actual attribute as well, which is pretty cool. So it goes both ways. So that's pretty awesome. So that's it for the warm-up exercise. Hopefully that one makes sense. Let's take a look at exercise 1. Okay, so for this one, we're going to amp it up a little bit. These are going to get more complex as we go along. I'd like you to, again, create a new HTML file that has these elements in it. So to start, a head with a title with some text in it, just like we saw with our previous exercise. Then I want you to create a body with an H1 again with some text inside of it, just so we have something to look at on the page. It's not just an empty checkbox in this case. And right after that, I'd like you to create an input box, or an input tag, I should say. That's a text box by default, right? So if you don't give an input a type, it defaults to kind of the text type by default, right? That's fine. So you can either manually do that or just leave it as a default, which I'd recommend here in this case. And we will see a text box pop up on the screen with kind of the default sizing and everything. So once you have that, open up the HTML file in your browser and the DevTools, just like we saw together with the warm-up. And then using the DevTools console, just like we used together, I want you to ask yourself and then actually do this. How would you change the input to, instead of being a text input, to be a checkbox? And what are some ways that you could do this, right? And then how would you actually check and uncheck that checkbox? And what are a couple ways, again, that you could do this, right? And as you're doing this, switch back and forth, just like we saw, to the Elements tab, and actually verify that in the DOM and in the HTML, it's being changed as you'd expect, because it should also show up visually. In this case, this is a checkbox, and you should see it actually check and uncheck if you were to change that, and change the value of the type as well. So give that a shot, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so to start here, I'm going to just create a new file. I'm going to say exercise-1.html. And I'm actually just going to go to my warm-up, and I'm going to copy all of this just so you don't have to watch me type it all out. I'm going to say that this is exercise 1 here for the title. I'll leave the H1 the same because we're not actually changing that in this case. But right after the H1, I'm going to put an input tag just like this. So again, we don't need to specify a attribute in this case, because by default, it's actually going to show up as a text input. Now, if I open this up in my Finder and I double click on that, what we'll see is pretty much the same thing as before, but now there is a text box over here, right? So if I open this up in my DevTools, what we'll see is that this is an input, and when I highlight over it, you can see that that's actually the input box. And I'm going to switch over to my console to start trying to figure out what to do with this. So our first instruction, right, is to change the input to be a checkbox. Okay, so how can we do this? Let's think about it. So we saw previously the attribute is what you can change it, as well as the property. So let's try the attribute first. So I'm going to say document.querySelector. I'm going to say input in this case, right? And that's going to give me this input. You can see it's being highlighted. I'm going to say .setAttribute, and I want to set the type attribute, which is the attribute that it defines what kind of input this actually is. And this is from the HTML specification. If you haven't seen this before, if we look at MDN and you look at the input HTML element, you can see that the type, and there's many different types in there that define the actual type of the input. So in this case, I want to set the type to be a checkbox, just like that. Okay. Now I'm going to count to 3. I'm going to say 1, 2, and 3. And look at that, right? So I press enter and it has changed the input type to be a checkbox. So if I switch back to not sources, I always click the wrong button. We can see that this attribute has been added. And by doing that, the browser knows to render this input box as a checkbox instead, right? Which is pretty cool, right? So this has changed from its default value of a text box to from a text box to a checkbox. That was hard to say. Now, one more thing we can do here is if I do document.querySelector.input, there is a type property on this, right? And this is again the reverse of what the same thing that we were doing in the warm-up exercises. This is the kind of the property version of that attribute in this case, since it's one of the default attributes. And if I change this to be text, just like this, let's see what happens, right? So there we go, it switches back, right? And if I switch back to the elements, we can see that this is now a type of text. And if I run the previous command that we saw before, I can switch it back to a checkbox. So that's pretty cool. So it goes both ways, right? So I'll clear my console there, and that solves that problem. Now, how do we actually check this checkbox? So let's try this. So we can say document.querySelector. I think I'm actually just going to press up here. I'm going to grab this input. I'm going to say .setAttribute. But in this case, what do I want to set? I want to set the checked attribute, right? But what do I want to set it to? Well, this is where things get a little bit kind of wonky, right? The checked attribute is actually a Boolean attribute, right? So maybe I don't need to give it a second value. I'll just say kind of this, right? I'll just say checked, just like that, right? Let's see what happens. So I'm going to run this and I get, an error. We failed to execute set attribute on the element. 2 arguments are required, but only 1 is present. Okay. So I'm basically saying that we do still kind of need to give it this second value, which is the value that we want to set the attribute to. So if I say checkbox here, not checkbox, I want to say checked. That's confusing. I'm going to just give it an empty string. Let's see what happens there. Okay. So I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3. And look at that, right? So it actually changes to be checked. And if I run this again, it just stays checked in this case because we're just setting the attribute checked on this to exist. So if I switch back to the Elements tab, we can see now that there's a checked property. Now this is, again, a little bit wonky depending on the browser you're using. Some browsers, I believe, actually show the equals like empty string, and some don't, like Firefox, I think. It doesn't really matter. And with the Boolean attributes, as long as they even exist, the value doesn't actually matter, right? So like, for example, let me show you what I mean. So I can say checked, and I can change this to be like, even I can say false, right? And you can see that it's still checked, right? And even though checked equals false, it's still checked. I didn't like uncheck it, right? And that's because this is a Boolean attribute. It's not actually checking the value. It's just checking the existence of the key for this attribute. So that checks it. That's a little bit weird feeling, right? Because it's like anything, a string, and that just kind of, it'll just make it show up. So how do we get rid of it then in this case? Because we can't really set it to be false. We can't like not give it a second value. Well, we can do document.querySelector of the input, and we can say .remove attribute. And what this will do is remove an attribute in this case. And in this case, we just want to remove the checked attribute. And if I count to 3 again, 1, 2, and 3, you can see that that's actually going to get rid of the check, which is pretty cool, right? So I can set it to be false in this case, which feels kind of weird, right? Because now it's just being checked, even though this value logically doesn't make sense. It's just seeing the existence again. But if I change this to be removed again, now it's totally gone. So that feels a little bit odd, right? And let's verify that it's gone. So there it is. It's totally gone from the DOM. So the other way that we can actually get to doing this is by doing this. We can say document.querySelector of the input, and we can say .toggle attribute. And we can toggle the checked attribute. Now this is a little bit easier to use and specifically made for Boolean attributes. So check this out, 1, 2, and 3, there we go. And now it's set to true. And if I go back here to my elements tab, you can see checked is on there again. And if I do this one more time, the same command, I go 1, 2, and 3, now it's gone back to false. And the checked is going to be gone when I go to the elements tab. So that's kind of nice, right? Definitely much cleaner and feels less kind of wonky than using kind of setting it to an empty string or something like that. Now, what we can also do finally, I mentioned there's 2 methods, but really there's one more, is I can just do the checked directly on this, right? And I can set this equal to true. And if I do that, you can see that this is now going to set it to be checked. And if I set it to be false, this will actually set it to be unchecked. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's take a look at exercise 2. Okay, now this one's a bit tricky, so definitely take your time with it. As I mentioned, these are getting progressively more challenging just to really test your skills. So for this one, I'd like you to create an HTML file that has these elements in it. Again, a head with a title with some text in it, a body with an h1 tag with some text in it. And this time, instead of an input tag, I'd like you to create a button tag with the text that says say hello inside of it. Okay. Then I want you to do the same thing. Open the file up in your browser and open up the DevTools alongside with it, and check to make sure everything in there makes sense when it comes to the DOM and the structure of it. Then in the DevTools, all right, so in the console of the DevTools, I want you to add the onclick, which looks just like this, all in lowercase, attribute. Be careful that's all lowercase, not the capital C camel case like we would see with something like React. So this is the onclick attribute to the button element. Okay, so add that attribute. What this attribute does, if you haven't seen it before, it's going to take some JavaScript code in a string, and it's going to execute it when this event happens. In this case, a click on this DOM element, in this case, a button. So we can put any JavaScript code in there, and I want you to put a log in there that's going to say why hello there when you click on it, right? So literally just put console log why hello there inside of this attribute, okay? And I want you to verify that when you do this, that it actually shows up in the DOM, and then it actually runs correctly when you click on the button. And I want you to think why this is happening. We haven't really studied events yet. We're going to get deeper into events later in future videos, as I mentioned here, kind of at the bottom. This is actually a really bad way to go about doing this. We're going to see much better ways to add these, what are called event listeners, in future videos as we get to those topics. But I want you to kind of take a look at how this might work. And I want you to try to change the code in there once you have it working to see if you can execute some other code and maybe log something out to the console, or maybe make like an alert pop up on the screen. So give that a shot, and then we'll go through this together. Okay, so to start here, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this exercise-2.html. And I'm going to go to my exercise 1. I'm going to copy all of that. I'm going to go to exercise 2, change that a little bit. And I'm going to change this input to be a button. And inside the button, I'm going to say hello. That is not how you spell hello. That's how you spell hello, right? And I'm going to open this up in my browser. And we're going to have this. And this time, this is going to be a button. And if I open this up in my console here, we can see that we indeed have this button, nothing fancy about it. And if I go to my console tab and I click the button, absolutely nothing happens that's interesting at all. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to set an attribute that's a special attribute on this button. This is an event listener attribute. So I'm going to say document.querySelector. I'm going to grab my button, which is this one, and I'm going to say .setAttribute. Now, those of you that have learned about events before are probably thinking, why should we do this? I know that we can add an event listener, right? And it's important to know that this is also another way to do this, not preferred way, but that it is possible. And understanding why it's possible and how it works is also really important to understanding events in general. So here we want to set the onclick, and again, be careful that it's lowercase, right? The onclick attribute, and then we're going to give it a string here. And the string is going to be the code that we want to execute when this event triggers on this DOM element. In this case, we're saying when the button is clicked, run this code inside of the string. So we want to do a console.log, and I'm going to say, I think, what did I say? Y, hello there, right? And closing the string. So be careful with how you do this, right? Because you can see I have a string inside of a string here because that's what console log expects. But I'm using single quotes out here for the actual string for the argument to set attribute. But then for the argument to console log, I'm using the double quotes right here. Okay, so I'm going to run this and nothing seems to happen, right? I'm going to switch back to my elements tab here and I'm going to take a look at this. So looks like there's an onclick and it's going to kind of look like this, right? It just looks like a regular string. I actually realized that I forgot to close my bracket. So let me kind of come back in here and I'm going to close this bracket right here. You're probably thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to fail. But at least I caught it by looking at it there. I think that's right. There we go. Right. If I switch back here, you can see that now it's going to be closed. Okay. So it's going to run this code when this event triggers, which is the onclick. So I'm going to come here, I'm going to clear my console here by pressing the clear button. I'm going to click on this button. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. There we go, right? And notice if I click it a bunch of times, I get a whole bunch of console logs, which is pretty awesome. So that's how you make that work, right? And I can actually change this to do whatever I want. So I can say, for example, instead of console log, I can say like alert, which is a browser event or browser kind of a dialog box that pops up that's really annoying and you shouldn't really use very much. But I can say like boo, right? And I can put that in an alert box. And if I do this, if I do a say hello, look at that. We get, it's a little bit small probably because I can't really zoom in on this part here, but I get this page says boo, right? And I can press OK to kind of dismiss it. Right? So a lot of cool stuff we can do with this. And again, this is not best practice. It's just important to realize that we can do this. So when you do see in other code, you can understand what's happening. We're actually going to be working with events and event listeners in a much easier to understand way and a much more robust way later on and a much more secure way as well. Okay, so hopefully you find that one interesting. Let's take a look at the final exercise for this video. Now, this one is definitely quite challenging, so take your time with it, and I'm going to try my best to explain it as in detail as possible. So for this one, like you again, as the other exercises, create an HTML file, right? Has these elements in it, a head with a title with some text, a body, and in the body is going to again have an h1 tag with some text, and then after the h1, I want you to create an empty script tag to start. Okay, now the reason for this is because the browser is going to be running our code in the HTML file from top to bottom. Okay, and if we have our script tag in the head where you normally would see a lot of script tags, and we don't set it up in a proper way, we actually are not going to be able to get access to anything that comes after that script tag, which is this h1. Very similar to how you can't really access variables that come after in a JavaScript file. It works the same way in HTML. So if we're going to have our script tag at the bottom, we can be sure that we have access to h1 when we do a query selector. But if we did it up in the head, we might not have access to the h1, and that could cause some issues depending on how we set up our script. Now, once you have that all set up and the skeleton set up, I'd like you to, inside of the script tag, right, which is at the bottom of the page, I'm going to write some code that is going to change the color of the h1 tag's text, right? So remember, there's going to be some text inside this h1 tag that whatever kind of text you want in there. And I want you to change it to blue and then to red and then to blue and then to red and then to blue and then forever, ever switching, right? And that switch is going to happen every 1 second. So it's going to go blue, red, right? And to do this, I want you to use a setInterval function, which is built into in this case, the browser API, which is going to allow us to run a function kind of repeatedly after a predetermined amount of time, in this case 1 second or 1000 milliseconds. If you haven't seen setInterval before, you can Google it on MDN and you can find pretty quickly how it works. It's just going to run a function repeatedly after some time. Then once you have this working, open up the file in your browser and the DevTools alongside it, and then verify the changes visually, right? Like just by looking at the text in the actual page, right? And then actually go switch to the Elements tab and actually watch the attributes change and make sure that makes sense as well. Now, I should mention that there are many ways that you can do this. You can like create a CSS file and things like that. This is all to be done through attributes directly. Okay, so no need for any CSS file or style tags or anything like that. Just do this directly through attributes. Okay, so give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let's create a new file here. We'll do exercise-3.html. And I'm gonna go to my exercise 2, copy all that, bring it over here, and I'm gonna change this to exercise 3. I'll leave this text here just for consistency's sake, and I'm gonna change this button to be a script tag. Okay, so in this script, what do we wanna do? Well, we wanna get access to this h1, so let's do that first. So I'm gonna say const h1 is equal to document.querySelector h1. So I'm going to have that in my h1 variable, so I don't have to keep doing document.querySelector like you saw me do multiple times in my DevTools. And in fact, what I'll do actually before I do that is I'll actually follow my steps and I'll open this up in my console and DevTools and just make sure that it actually works as expected. So if I open this up, I'm going to zoom in a whole bunch here and I'll open up my terminal or DevTools, I should say, and then there we go. So we have my script tag and then we have the h1 tag right here. Okay, cool. So that's all pretty great. So let's switch back to VS Code. And in here, now what do we want to do? Well, we want to make it so that we can set the attribute for this h1 to change its styling. All right, so we can do inline styling by setting the style attribute, right? Generally, you don't want to set inline styles, but there are many cases where you might want to set an inline style, and we're going to do it in this case through the attributes. You can also do this through the style property, but we will look at that in future videos because there's a bunch of cool stuff we can do as well there when it comes to styling and class lists and things like that. So for this one, what I want to do is see if I can change the color to be blue to start. So let me just see if I can do this. I'm going to say h1.setAttribute, and I want to set the attribute of the style. Okay, so what do I want the style to be? Well, the style is, it kind of follows the the CSS kind of structure and semantics. So we're going to use the American speller for color here, and I'm going to just say blue. Okay, just like this. And this is a CSS rule to change the text color to be, in this case, blue, right? So let's switch back to my browser. I'm going to reload this page and look at that, right? So we can see that if I come to my Elements tab here, we can see that this has an inline style of color blue now. Right? And if I come in here and I edit the attribute and I change this to, like, let's say red, right? And I click outside here, then we can see that now this has changed to red, right? So what we want to do is we want to flip this from blue to red, from blue to red, from blue to red. All right, so let's come back to our code and see what we can do. So what this is doing is it's setting it to blue right away. So that's kind of fine, but we want to put this on like a timer, like an infinitely running timer. So we want this to happen every 1 second, but not always to be blue. We want to switch between blue and red. So let's set up our timer to start. So I'm going to do a setInterval, and this is going to take 2 arguments, right? The first argument is a function. So I'm just going to put that in here, just like that. And I'm going to put some code in here. And the second one is the time that we want this function to run, or how often we want this function to run. In this case, in milliseconds. So I'm going to say after every 1000 milliseconds, run this code. And I'm going to move my attribute up into this function. So if I save this file really quick, let's see what happens. I'm going to come back to Chrome and reload the page. So it starts off black and then it goes to blue, right? So take a look at both the visual here and then the actual attribute here. So no attribute and then it goes to blue, right? No attribute and then it goes to blue, right? So that works pretty well. So that's closer to what we want, but not really, because we want it to also go to red. So we could probably say, well, okay, well then I want to set it to be red. Not set, I want it to be red, right? So let's do this, and I save that, and I come back in here, I reload the page, and oh, it goes straight to red. Okay, you can see it keeps switching to red every 1 second, hence this attribute kind of flickering over here. It's going blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, right? So how do we kind of fix this? Because we're never really seeing the blue because it's only for like a split millisecond. We need to check to see what it is right now. And then if it's blue, we change it to red. And if it's red, then we change it to blue, right? So we can say if, and I'll say h1 dot get attribute, and I'll just say style. And in this case, we could actually use the .style property, probably much easier than this, but I want to show you kind of if we were just using attributes, what would this look like? I'm going to say, is this a get attribute of style equal to the color of blue, right? And if it is, then what I want to do is I want to set it to be red. Otherwise, I want to set it to be blue. Right? So if the style is already blue, then set the attribute to be red. Otherwise, set it to be blue. Let's see if this works. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to my browser, refresh the page, and let's see. So it goes blue, then red, then blue, then red, then blue, then red. Now that is pretty awesome, right? I guess if I did green and red, that'd be like, I guess a Christmas theme, but let's go with blue and red. That looks pretty cool. So this is pretty awesome, right? If I switch back here and I do document.get query selector, and then I want to do my h1, and I say .get attributes just to show you what this looks like, and I say style, right? You can see that it's blue. And then it's still, I guess I'm always getting it when it's blue, and then it's red, right? So you can see that we get the entire string here, including the semicolon. So this is really, really tricky. What we're literally checking is the string for this attribute, just like any other attribute. To make this easier, there's other properties like style that we can actually use. So to give you a teaser as to what that looks like, we can say .style. Right? And if I do this, you can see that there's a whole bunch of styles on here, but color is, I believe, the main one. So if I scroll down to A, B, C, color, L, M, N, O, where's color? C-O-L-O-R. You can see that in the case that where I actually grabbed it, it was red, right? So it's filled in with the string red. So this is a nice object that we can kind of grab and actually do like .style.color. Right, so if I do .style.color, you can see that it's blue, then red, then blue, then red, right? And we'll get more into detail on this in future videos. But for now, appreciate that it is really these attributes, right, that are changing for even things like styling and the event listeners, the Boolean attributes, and even just regular old attributes. We can even use this for our own custom attributes that are prefixed with data dash something. Okay, so I hope you found this video interesting and valuable. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. In the next video, what we're going to be doing is finally, I can't wait, we're going to be looking at how we can create our own HTML elements using the Create Element API in the DOM. Until now, we've seen that we can actually create elements using things like inner HTML, but I mentioned that this is something that we generally don't want to do because of many implications like security. The correct way to do this is using create element, and it's a very powerful tool that allows us to actually create anything that we want, absolutely any element, and we have all of the power of the DOM APIs exposed to us, and we can change this element before we even put it into the actual DOM tree, before we visualize it. So super awesome things like changing the attributes, changing the event listeners, and many other fun stuff to go along with it. I can't wait to get to that video. I'll see you in that one. See you later.